Hello and welcome to another exciting week of Political Party. I'm Hamish.
I'm Tim, and with us is a new guest this week. Louis, introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Louis. How's everyone going? Second year arts global student. Pretty happy to be on the show. It's my first time here.
Good to hear, Louis. So, coming up in the show this week, firstly, a debate on trade versus aid. Secondly, Blundergate, a segment where we examine the humorous mistakes of our politicians. Then, less sexy than ISIS, a segment in which we examine events in the Middle East that have been overshadowed by the looming ISIS threat. And finally, parodies from the internet.
Beautiful. So today we're going to talk about aid versus trade. What this debate is, on one side you've got trade, which promotes, the crux of this debate is development. Third world countries, developing countries. How do we help them urbanize? How do we help them modernize? Is modernizing even important? Should we be helping them at all? On one side, you've got trade, which promotes international interconnectedness through the WTO. So you trade with a country, they then have access to technology. They therefore modernize through that technology.
And trade means a lot of things. It could mean just outright exports and imports, or it could mean foreign direct investment, foreign ownership of factories, as we've seen in places like China, that sort of thing.
And depending on how far you want to go when you're defining the topic, you could also define trade as cultural exchange. So, for example, Australians and Americans watching, a speech that Barack Obama delivers at Australian Parliament, for example.
Cultural exchange, yep.
And finally, we've got aid on the other side. Aid is where you give direct assistance, government to government. In the official sense, it's government to government to developing countries to help them. To give them money so they can create infrastructure.
You give them direct money, give them direct assistance, send specialists over to assist them in development of key sectors, that sort of thing. And we have another guest on the show.
Well, hi
Xavier,
there.
Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Hamish and Tim.
And Louis.
Great. And Louis, I've met you before.
Yeah,
Zave, introduce yourself. Tell us a bit about your views about the world and stuff.
My views about the world. Okay, so I'm Xavier, study arts at Monash. Since this is a political show, I'd say I'm like centre-left on most issues, but I can fluctuate quite far to the right on other issues, so it's quite a mixed bag.
And how do you feel about trade versus aid?
Trade versus aid. What? Can you specify how I feel on certain
So
issues?
I'll just quickly summarize the intro that we just gave to this segment. Trade versus aid is a debate about how you best get development. For developing countries.
So
trade promotes WTO, international cooperation, so they can gain access to technology which helps them modernize. Aid says, let's give money to that country, let's give experts, let's teach them how to do it themselves.
So an example of trade would be places like Bangladesh, India, China, Taiwan, Japan. We traded heavily with them when they were underdeveloped. And examples of aid would be Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, etc., countries that we just hand out money to. Now, notice the difference in development between these two blocks I mentioned.
You guys have probably touched on this point already, but one of the problems with aid is it's often tied with loans, and the countries that are receiving those loans have to pay interest back on them, which in turn traps them in a cycle of poverty. So trade's kind of a more efficient way of doing things, because it allows the country to be self-sustaining instead of being trapped in a poverty cycle.
I think one of the other problems is that aid works best when it's carried out on a community level. When you're working with local groups who know exactly what they need and how to go about getting that. And large-scale aid projects often run into brick walls in that context, as they find it quite difficult to make the money go as far as it possibly could.
So what do you think about all of China's aid in Africa then, with that in mind? China's massive development of infrastructure in Africa.
Good point.
That's clearly aid. But is it aid to encourage trade? That's the question.
Well, that's it. It's clearly working, and the Chinese situation in Africa is more. It's definitely more to benefit China over anyone else. I mean, the People's Republic of China isn't exactly a benevolent
let's face
state.
it, not many governments are going to be very altruistic
Exactly.
in
Not
their
at
handing out
all.
of aid.
It's like we give aid to our Pacific neighbours so that they don't become unstable and, as a result, become hotbeds for violence and conflict that could potentially spill over into Australia. We don't give it to them out of the kindness of our heart, purely.
Well, it's definitely working in Africa. I mean, you're seeing massive infrastructure development, roads, railways, highways, all kinds of good things.
Does the fact that China's giving out this money and they're obviously gaining quite a bit of influence over the governance of these projects and stuff, and that can be seen as like neo-imperial or whatever. Do you think that the power that China gets from giving them money justifies the amount of money that they get?
I think that one of the key things for me is that it's about capacity building. I mean, a lot of the aid that's directed into these countries is things like infrastructure and education, so that communities and individuals have greater power themselves to improve their own circumstances. And I think that's probably got to be one of the key focuses in aid.
Yeah, because one of my main problems with aid is that often people, groups, countries that receive aid end up falling into a handout mentality where they can't really do anything for themselves. They are dependent on foreign help, on foreign aid. And I can't help but wonder, the fact that we purely or mostly give aid to our Pacific neighbours, could that be a strategy to keep them in check as well as prevent them from going unstable?
I disagree. I think that regional economic cooperation, regional stability is only good for all the states involved. Sure, Australia gives a lot of advisors, experts, teachers, military and economic aid to countries like East Timor and Indonesia. Well, not so much anymore. Woohoo. But we do that because if they have a booming economy, so do we. That helps us trade, that helps us move, that helps us, that reduces the burden on us in the long term in the region because we don't have to give them, military help when the country is doing quite well. I think that it's mutually beneficial to have regional stability. What do you think?
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense to me. But what if their stability is based off the assistance of Australian experts, of Australian NGOs? So long as they stay there, these countries are going to be stable and good. But if we pull them out, there could be consequences for that country.
Well, I think one of the key things here is probably the idea of education. I mean, the more educated a population is, the more capacity they have to develop themselves, and the less reliant they're going to be on foreign aid. The more individuals they have within their country that are willing and able to make those sort of differences for sort of individual empowerment within these countries, then the less reliance they're going to be on nations like Australia for handouts.
Yeah, but the problem with things like aid is that sometimes local communities just aren't willing to accept any of it. Now, I'd like to use a very controversial example here and say Aboriginal communities in Australia. They, from what I've heard from people who've been to these communities, they have fallen into a mentality where they've come to rely on handouts from the government, and that's why they're having their money cut off, because the government wants to remove this culture of dependency. But they have actually fallen into this pattern of accepting money from us, justifying it by saying, you took our land, therefore we have the right to take your money. That's a problem when it comes to the aid model, and I think that trade does a better job than aid of rectifying this issue, because trade ensures that these people are actually working to get their money.
That's an interesting distinction you've made there, because when you give aid to a country, the government gains like influence or whatever, and like that country's able to like get they're able to learn the skills that they need to be self-sufficient. But when you're promoting an idea like trade over aid, who do you think is best to help a country modernize? The government of a neighboring country who probably has some sort of vested interest in them being somewhat sufficient, or BP building wells in that state to generate capital.
The thing with BP building wells to generate capital is that they need local workers to run the wells, so they're going to have to educate them. And I'm not saying that corporate control of a state is a good thing, far from it. But it does help a lot with education. These businesses have an interest in it. They will do everything they can to maximize profits, even if that includes the education of locals.
What do you think, Hamish?
Or Zave?
I think you need a bit of both, both the public and the private. I mean, most of the money is tied up in the private sphere, and so as long as you've got government oversight of those private investments and loans, it's not really a problem, because as you said, it's developing infrastructure, it's educating the population, and more importantly, it's providing work for the locals.
Fair enough.
Yeah, Louis.
I don't know. I think that it's very easy to get caught up in a profit focused. In a profit-focused rhetoric. I guess that's the kind of world we live in. But there's also examples of people like Muhammad Yunus and the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh, sort of social enterprises which work on a community level and have been able to develop things like sanitation, so building toilets, also solar panels for local people, where instead of, for example, buying kerosene lamps, the same money that they would have to buying kerosene lamps, they slowly work towards paying off on a solar panel on their roofs. And then after a couple of years, they've paid it off and they've got that extra money as dispensary income. So I think there's an alternative there, which is also worth its merit.
They're a bank, though. Don't they have to pay interest on those loans, even if it is only a small amount of interest?
Yes, but the thing is that a lot of the money that makes it back into the Grameen Bank, it doesn't go towards profit. They reinvest it into the businesses that they run, which means that there's less interest that needs to be paid.
I reckon that's a good model. Microfinance is a good model for developing nations. It's probably one of the few examples where aid is going to produce a good outcome, because microfinance ensures that people have the capacity to get up off their feet and start their own businesses, but also there's little risk from microfinance simply because you're investing so little.
Yeah, that's I think that's like an interesting segue, because what I want to sort of start talking about before we go to the next song is the fact that trade allows countries to maintain their dignity, right? Because when you've got aid inherently means that a developed country has said that you are worthy of our money. Trade is merely the filling of economic demand in that country, right?
Yeah.
If that country wants to be a part of that economic model, then that means that the market will determine which country needs aid, not just countries that find it financially viable in order to have them.
Well, personally, I'd take it a step further and say that aid is basically a way of saying, look at us, we're better than you, we help you out, our way is best, we know best. Whereas trade at least allows a certain flexibility for the country to go about its own path, work out
Louis,
what's
what do you
best for
think?
itself.
I think I'm going to have to disagree on that one. I don't think that aid is inherently sort of I'm better than you and I'm going to be the superior one in this relationship. I think that there can be a level of altruism there where it's saying I've been perhaps more privileged in the way that I've developed, but I'm willing for you to be able to develop those own capacities yourself. Obviously, there's going to be political triggers tied into that, but I think that it's not entirely a sort of inferiority-superiority complex relationship going on.
Well, I reckon that this attitude would definitely be more prevalent. Like, the attitude of we're doing it for altruism would definitely be more prevalent through the NGO method of aid. But the problem with NGOs is you've seen them operating in places like Africa and many African states for well over 30 years, and these places are still in extreme poverty, so you have to question the effectiveness of these altruistic methods.
Yeah, NGOs is a good point, because we're about to talk about that after
Stay
our
tuned
first song.
for more.
Our first song is about how love and peace and human cooperation is going to lead to better outcomes for humanity. I guess we need to love each other to get peace, and we're not going to get that if we have, infighting.
Make love, not war.
This is Placebo with Loud Like Love. Louis, talk to me about fair trade.
Well, all right, I'm going to try and do the best job I can here. I'm involved with Oxfam on the uni campus, so we're pretty involved with FairTrade. I'll try and give you a quick rundown. Basically, it's a certification that farmers will pay for that sort of, as a consumer, will guarantee to you some level of ethical treatment of workers when you're buying goods. So take the example of coffee. If you're buying FairTrade coffee, you know that the farmers of that particular coffee brand are going to have been paid at least some wage. They're not going to be treated in a... Sorry about that. They're not going to have been treated in...
Sorry, technical issues.
That's all right. All right.
So the thing with fair trade is that
keep
fair trade
going.
ensures that farmers are being treated in an ethical manner and being paid for their produce, because in a lot of these places, the farmers don't actually see a scrap of the money that the multinational corporations extract from them and from their produce.
And it's by no means a perfect certification system. It's still got some issues that have probably yet to be ironed out, but it does guarantee that basic level.
Yeah, which is a good thing, really, because a lot of the time in places in these third world nations which export things like coffee, things like cocoa, their competition is intense among farmers to see who can sell their products to multinational corporations for the lowest price. Because whoever sells them for the lowest price is going to at least be able to stay alive and get rid of their crop. So it's really a race to the bottom in these countries, which is an important term when talking about trade versus aid. And
Yep.
lax regulations ensure that as a result, these people receive virtually no money. But the thing is, the lax regulations are there in order to attract multinational corporations who will invest in these countries, because multinational corporations will always place the bottom line first and always act in a way that ensures them the biggest profit.
Do you think it's then the impetus is on consumers to put some pressure on their multinational companies to regulate better, or to perhaps look as to other ways that they're not going to treat their workers or the environment poorly in their conduct overseas?
I'd agree with you. Nothing's really going to change unless consumers are aware of what goes on in these places and act accordingly. And the problem we have is that a lot of the time consumers will know about these issues, but they'll still think, oh, well, I'm a poor uni student, or I'm living off Centrelink payments. I have to buy the cheapest products no matter what. Screw the African children. I may end up like them if I don't buy these really cheap goods. So that's a problem, but definitely I would agree that it is important for consumers to understand the importance of fair trade in order to turn the multinational corporations. They'll follow the profits, and if the profits are in fair trade, then the multinational corporations will be there too.
Right,
And they'll try to find some way to screw it over.
There's
but
definitely a movement towards ethical consumption, especially in the modern world. In the environmental issue, there's the process of greening a product to make it more attractive because it's sustainable. That's happening in terms of fair trade as well. People want to buy things that are benefiting others, and they want to feel better about it.
Yeah, they want to buy things that were produced sustainably that aren't leading to people getting horribly screwed over. One problem that we face, though, is a lot of the time, companies that embrace these things like fair trade, such as Cadbury, are found to be unethical on other issues, such as palm oil. So it's kind of, you've got to really prioritize, I suppose.
Yeah, there's I don't think it's necessarily correct to blame the consumer for following the cheapest prices, because that is the role of the consumer in the market, right? To follow where the trends are going. But I think it's important that like that point that you brought up, Hamish, about how this growing movement of people going to buy fair trade food and, clothing and stuff is going to increase the demand for that stuff.
Yeah.
But at the same time, when you go to one of those really hipster cafes and you want to buy a fair trade coffee, it's significantly more expensive.
Yeah.
And can you blame, in an increasingly expensive world, I don't think you can necessarily blame people for following the cheapest price.
Look, I've got to be honest. I always go for the cheapest goods because I use the justification that I'm a poor uni student and therefore I need to save as much money as possible. So this is really a problem when it comes to fair trade.
But I think, and not even just talking about fair trade here, but I think that there's probably a dearth in the way that we look at people when they're buying certain goods. So I think on one hand you've got ethical, more sustainable goods, and on the other hand you've got sort of the cheap supermarket stuff, which more or less often doesn't treat animals or humans or the environment in the same way. But I think you can sort of, as a uni student, you can find the middle ground between the two. You may not be able to afford the most expensive, paying their workers well, environmental goods on every product that you buy, but you may be able to find the middle ground where you can go, this is only 50 cents more, I may be able to buy this one, and this one's a couple of dollars more, so I might have to pass on that one. But just trying to do as much as you can, trying to be constructive in your outlook, I think is probably the important thing.
The way I justify it is, this stuff is probably going to taste better. That's got to be, it's got to have some advantage, and even if it's not true, I can fool myself into thinking it's true, so that's all good. But in a lot of cases, branded stuff will actually taste better than no brand stuff that was produced without fair trade.
I tell myself I'll buy the fair trade stuff when I'm older and I have more income.
Yeah.
Right now I'm a uni student living on not a lot of money, but if I do follow through with that promise, it's another question.
I would like to give one example. Chocolate. I always buy Cadbury chocolate or Lindt chocolate because store chocolate just isn't as good. And Cadbury chocolate is produced with fair trade. I don't know about Lindt, but
how much does that inform your decision over the taste factor?
It really doesn't inform it very much, but the fact is the quality is with the company that endorses fair trade. And I think that's an important thing for companies to consider as well, is that they can really focus on marketing this image of, we've got willing farmers, therefore the willing farmers will produce better quality goods.
Hamish, talk to us about structural adjustment programs. I sort of want to change the topic a bit because I think that you brought up a really interesting point in the last segue. So Tell us about that.
Structural adjustment programs are a kind of loan. Is it the World Bank or the IMF that gives them out? I think it's...
The World Bank gives non-concessional loans, which means that they give low to no interest loans, whereas the IMF gives high interest, high austerity loans.
The problem with structural... So, SAPs are IMF, aren't they?
Yes.
So, the problem with SAPs is that they come with very stringent conditions attached, mainly things like market liberalisation, privatisation of countries.
Which is often a pretext to political liberalisation as well.
Yeah, and they're a one-size-fits-all solution. The IMF will typically prescribe the same structural adjustment program everywhere with varying degrees of success. I'd like to point out Argentina suffered an economic recession during either the 90s or the 2000s. The details escape me, but either way, the recession happened as a direct result of structural adjustment programs and the privatisation of key industries. So, structural adjustment programs, while providing much-needed money for developing countries to help develop, often open the way for corruption, for multinational takeover of key industries or key utilities. So, they've definitely got their problems, and they have, in fact, largely been blamed for many issues that plague the developing world.
Do you want to elaborate on that, Xav?
Look, I'm kind of pro structural adjustment just because of the fact that its kind of core idea is to proliferate the ideas of liberalism. Not so much, I favour this not so much economically, but more politically, because structural adjustment is used often as a bargaining chip by the IMF and, financial institutions to try to get autocratic states to liberalise financially, economically as well, but also to kind of bring some kind of political liberalisation in.
That's interesting.
And so it's a useful bargaining tool, but as Hamish did point out, it can be kind of corrupted.
The problem is, I would also argue political liberalisation isn't necessarily in everyone's interests. Some places, I'm going to go out here and say it, some places just aren't ready for political liberalisation. Take a look at the Middle East. Look what happened when the whole Arab Spring happened, when the whole political liberalisation thing happened. The political liberalisation enabled radical elements to become much stronger and emboldened by a lack of authority keeping them repressed. And as a result, we now have ISIS, we now have extreme instability in the Middle East. It's a choice between either a non-liberal strongman who's full of repression or chaos.
Okay,
that
was a bit of a non-trade tangent there, but it's an important point to bring up, particularly about the role of non-state actors in this system as well. What do you all think about NGOs? Do you think that there's too many of them, not enough? Do you think they're effective? Do you think they're ineffective? Is their mere existence symbolically important? Louis?
NGOs of varying degrees of... Louis.
Well, I think we had a little bit of a chat about this while the song was going on. I think it's very easy to be cynical and belittle the impact that a lot of NGOs have had. Perhaps they haven't been as effective as they could have been. There's certainly none of them are perfect, and they've still got a long way to go. But at the same time, there's been some very effective work that's been carried out. And I think it's important to acknowledge that, but also look at ways of improving that moving forward.
I'd argue that traditional NGOs, ones that you typically associate with, such as World Vision, these big charities, they've actually become kind of useless. They've gotten too big for their own good, too full of managerial stuff, and too few of the contributions ever actually make it to the site. I'd argue the way forward with NGOs is with smaller ones that more directly communicate with their investors and the people that they help.
I think perhaps there is some merit in that argument, but I think at the same time it's these big organisations, they have a massive marketing clout. Yeah. They get a lot of money coming in, and I think that if these big organisations can work in tandem with community organisations on the ground, then they're going to see a much greater impact from their work.
Yeah, well, I mean, I just think if it was possible for that to happen, it probably would have happened already. But the fact that it hasn't happened indicates that it probably won't happen for some reason or another. Maybe these big organizations are just too elitist, see themselves as the only avenue. Maybe it's because they've become corrupted by a desire for profit. Who knows? There are many considerations to take into account here, I think.
Cool. So we've covered a lot of topics. We've looked at fair trade, international free trade agreements, globalization, structural adjustment, NGOs, all that stuff. We'll quickly go around and have a look at some conclusions here if you guys are able to get to any. Hamish, trade, aid, both or neither?
Well, I'm an advocate of trade over aid, but at the same time, trade definitely presents its own problems. I think in a perfect world, every product would be fair trade, and that would encourage the most development because it would ensure that farmers get the money to lift themselves off subsistence. But at the same time, it probably won't happen, and a lot of the time trade results in a race to the bottom that lowers living standards for everyone or keeps living standards very low because, I'll be honest, some of these places really couldn't have much worse living standards. So that's my views on the topic.
Call me an optimist, call me an idealist, but I believe in aid. I still think that it has a place in our world. It certainly has some aspects that could be refined, and I certainly think that trade has its merits as well. But I think that there's still definitely a place for aid in the world that we live in.
I'm gonna have to agree with Louis on this. I think aid, when it's well directed, when it's well designed, definitely does have a place. As long as you can kind of undercut or get rid of systems such as corruption, government siphoning of this aid, kind of address issues of concessional loans and high interest, it definitely does have its merits.
I'm with you. I'm with you on the aid. I think aid is a more official and more regulated way of teaching countries how to fend for themselves. I think that trade only further entrenches dependence on the developed world, and that, perpetuates the cycle of, that gap between the developed and developing countries, which, lets the rich
But
profit off the poor.
aid also creates a cycle of dependency because many countries are kind of relying on it for their livelihoods. But I feel like, to me, aid is a good stepping stone on the way to trade, but trade is ultimately the way forward because it encourages sustainability. Like, even if... Yeah.
So, our next song is relevant, I guess, because we've been blaming a lot of people and we've been, purporting a lot of solutions to problems that aren't exactly that simple. The next song is a highly political song from a fucking awesome band called Sum 41. The premise of this song is, stop pointing the fingers at people for creating problems because we're all to blame, which is the name of this song. This is Sum 41.
And we are back. This week, Blundergate, not exactly examining a humorous mistake. This week, we examine the collateral damage caused by drone strikes in the Middle East.
Yeah. In late last year, the US-led airstrikes against Islamic State were purported to be very successful at the time. However, recent developments from activists in the area have claimed that particularly the Syrian Organization for Human Rights have said that 52 civilians were killed in the indiscriminate bombing led by US drones in November last year. So we'll get everyone's opinions on this. Hamish, what do you think?
No matter how precise the missile, you're not going to make an omelette without breaking some eggs. If you're dropping missiles on people, it's inevitable that sooner or later civilians will be impacted by them. No matter how hard you try, no matter how precise the weapon, you're going to make mistakes. You're going to slip up. And I don't know, I can't help but feel that these airstrikes are very dangerous because it's really it's a precipice. You're gauging local support for the airstrikes against the possibility you'll kill civilians and turn the local population against you and against your allies by extension. So it's really a very fine balance.
And it's hard to maintain that balance when the enemy, the terrorist groups such as ISIS, are embedding themselves within civilian populations to make it harder for the foreign interveners to target them.
Maybe it's not even to make it harder. Maybe it's just what they want. After all, ISIS does view itself as a legitimate state. They're working very hard to become a state, doing such things as developing infrastructure, having a system of government. They're doing things typical of a state, and that, by its very nature, means they're going to have a civilian presence.
And it makes it harder for foreign powers to target them if they're embedded with that population.
Yeah.
The US and its allies are going to be reluctant to launch strikes.
Especially given what happened last time.
Well, yeah, there you go. Like, when they do, they face international criticism, so they can't really win.
And here's another problem. How can you tell if the target you killed was an ISIS member or a legitimate civilian when they're embedded in the civilian population? You can't tell, and that can be used as propaganda spin by your enemies.
Is it valid to say that Islamic State is not a legitimate state and therefore we should indiscriminately bomb everywhere where we think they are? Because civilians are dying here in large number.
Well, the thing with ISIS is that they are opposed to us. Therefore, it is in our national interest to crush them and prevent them from taking root.
Sure, but they're also committing genocide, so I think that's a reasonable enough excuse. Louis, what do you think about?
I think one of the biggest problems here is that people are very willing to. My mic's still working?
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah,
People are very willing to sort of characterize all the people living under ISIS under one big blanket, and that leads to a general loss of value for the human lives that are a result of these drone strikes. And I think that sure, if the US is going to carry out the drone campaigns, then civilians are going to die. But there needs to be some sort of level of transparency and accountability for those drone strikes, so that the US can't get away with killing 50, 60 civilians and just having an apology and wiping it off and keep going with the drone strikes. I don't think that that's necessarily morally justifiable.
Yeah, personally, I'm not really in favour of airstrikes or intervention because I believe people in these regions have a very long-term memory when it comes to political decisions. They remember what we did years and years ago, and they are not going to forgive us for our past crimes. So we need to keep our crimes down to a minimum.
So
Otherwise,
you don't
there's a
support
long-term problem.
intervening in northern Iraq?
I
and
don't
Syria?
support intervening because it's a very delicate balance and you could easily cause more harm than solutions. Because a lot of, sure, in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, there were a lot of tribesmen who were willing to join our side because we were better than the Taliban. But at the same time, our very presence there was an offense to many people who end up forming ISIS. And
A corrupt government had weapons of mass destruction, though. Can you let that happen? They let Rwanda happen.
well, I mean, we only didn't let it happen because there was oil in Iraq, and there were also a bunch of, not just oil, there was a bunch of other political issues that the US wanted sorted out, like trade, oil investment. Actually, it was kind of screwing over France, but that's a topic for another day. There were a lot of reasons in Iraq for the West to intervene other than stopping the use of weapons of mass destruction, and furthermore, Saddam didn't actually have them.
Right,
and
but
the
he was
intelligence-
perceived to have them, so it doesn't
The
really
intelligence was faulty, but I guess you're right. I guess it is the perceived threat, but I still would have been content to let it slip.
On the 23rd of April this year, Barack Obama gave a very emotional press conference apologizing to the US public for two Americans who were... two Western hostages. One was American, one was Italian, who were killed during an indiscriminate drone strike in Pakistan. Although that also killed... it purportedly killed a dozen innocent civilians in the process. So do you think it's the US's responsibility to show remorse for this?
I think so. I mean, they blew up these people. They should apologize. But what good is apologizing going to do? Apologizing isn't going to bring the people back.
No, I think a greater effort needs to be made, not just by the United States, but in a global context, to kind of humanize the people living in these circumstances. They're not. It's, as I said before, it's very easy to kind of characterize them all as perhaps people who subscribe to the ISIS ideology. But there's a lot of people living in these regions of the world who are going to be very adversely affected by this, and they've got little empowerment, little of a say within their own lives, and they're simply the victims of the situation.
I'd
Dave?
absolutely agree.
I'm going to sound awful here, but I'm very pro-intervention in these situations because if we look at it just from a basic human level, people are being killed on a huge scale. We saw what happened in Rwanda, in other areas where kind of genocide was allowed to creep in. And I kind of feel as an international community, we have an obligation to stop that.
Fair enough. I would counter by saying that that Western intervention was what caused this genocide in the first place. It was our intervention in the Gulf War that led to the radicalization of Osama bin Laden. It was our war against Osama bin Laden that led to the creation of ISIS. And I don't know, I think it's best that we keep out for the long term because whatever we cause now, whatever we do now could lead to even greater long-term harm.
And speaking of imperialism and intervention, we're going to talk about a heroic rescue after we get our next song, which is about the Spanish conquest of Latin America and the negative effects of that. This is 30 Seconds to Mars with Conquistador.
And welcome back to Political Party. This segment, less sexy than ISIS.
issues in the Middle East that have been overshadowed because everyone
the
wants
ISIS
to talk
boogeyman.
about ISIS and the ISIS boogeyman. This week, this is sort of early last week, a group of 300 women and girls were rescued from the captivity of acknowledged terrorist group Boko Haram by the Nigerian military.
The word haram means not legitimate for Muslims. Trivia.
There you go. So yeah, a big deal was made about this. It's still, for those wondering, it's still unclear whether or not these were the schoolgirls that were abducted midway through last year with the whole Bring Back Our Girls campaign.
Yeah.
But this is a good news story because
It's got a lot of different viewpoints, a lot of different issues to be tackled. So I'd say the first issue is this: is the operation has come under criticism because there are complaints that the army may not have actually rescued these women at all, and they may have just been from villages that the army advanced into. The army may have been lying about its progress in order to seem more effective. That's an issue. Are they really telling the truth?
I'm not sold on that argument. I think that this is I think that Boko Haram has been controlling large areas of that province in Nigeria, particularly on the Sambisa Forest Reserve where they were found.
Yeah.
I think that it's incredibly important that we hear about this story, and I think that it's a positive thing. And until we get like some clarification that the Nigerian government just doctored this, I think that it's perfectly fine to acknowledge that this was a good outcome. Louis, what do you think?
It's definitely a good outcome, but another claim made was that there was no actual fighting, but Boko Haram had retreated and left these girls behind. But either way, it's still a good outcome because these are 300 girls or women that would have been ended up, basically sex slaves, forced converts, had their free wills stripped from them. These are 300 people who are now somewhat safer.
I think personally, I think that, I haven't heard anything about it being sort of a forged mistake. I think that from the news that we have received, it's pretty clear that the coalition forces in Nigeria have made some sort of progress in the last couple of months or so. But it's sort of refreshing. I don't speak on a personal level of advocacy, but it's sort of refreshing, I think, for a lot of the Nigerian people who've lived through this situation for so long where they've been under threat, and they're now seeing some kind of progress take place, where a really strong effort is being taken against Boko Haram.
And also a strong effort from both the Christian and Muslim communities in Nigeria against Boko Haram. A lot of the people fighting in the Nigerian forces, they're Christian, they're Muslim, but they're united against this common problem.
That's a good thing with external threats, isn't it? They unite sworn enemies.
And quickly to finish up on this topic, if anyone wants to know more about this issue of Boko Haram, there's a really good kind of documentary series on YouTube by Vice News. It's about 3 episodes, 15 minutes long each, that kind of looks at Nigeria and Boko Haram.
Sound advice.
We needed a pun. It's been a while.
Yeah.
Our next and last song is "Help I'm Alive" by Metric, which is about how the pressures on women in society can be almost crippling, which is I guess sort of relevant to that last topic. And when we come back, we've got parody news, which is always fun. So yeah, this is Metric with "Help I'm Alive."
Welcome back, Jinx Tim.
Welcome to Parody News, where we're going to talk about news that is a parody and it's absolutely false.
Or
in
it
every
could be
single
real.
way.
We don't know.
We're gonna.
Guess you'll just have to
we've
guess,
got a
listeners.
story for you guys, and I'm going to read you the headline, and you tell me if you reckon it's a real story or if you reckon it's complete bullshit, and then we'll have a talk about it. So this week's story: Texas governor deploys the state guard to stave off Obama takeover.
It's got to be false. Like,
I don't know. It's Texas. Anything's possible.
Thanks, Obama.
It's true. This is like no shit. This Texas governor, he's a Republican. Governor Greg Abbott ordered the Texas
Abbott's. Yeah, something to do with Abbott's.
Ordered the Texas National Guard to monitor a joint special forces training exercise that was initiated by Barack Obama. because he thinks that, like the power of Obama should be like
More
checked
government
and stuff. But
Does you generally believe that the Obama and the National Army is going to try to take over Texas?
Probably.
Yeah,
And
which
that's why
is-
it's
still-
still
you don't
state
know.
And you know
force.
what? I think it's a perfectly legitimate concern. I think that Obama's reaching his final term, and like it's
Look,
it's
he's
quite
already-
important for Obama to kind of solidify his
To rein in
clout and
those
stuff.
Texans, yeah.
And this
already-
guy's doing an excellent job at doing what he needs to
See,
do.
I
and
think what
fulfilling his
Obama's
role at
doing
the
is
moment.
he's already inflicted Obamacare on us all as a way to, or not
On
us, but
us,
them.
yes, us
He's inflicted
Australians.
Obamacare on them as a way to like subvert their control of their own
Yeah.
medical destiny. And now what he seeks to do is ensure that he can remain president, that he has the military presence throughout America to undermine that constitutional amendment which limits presidential
Especially the
terms.
free independent state of Texas.
Yeah, Texas.
Well, I really do think Texas should be its own state. The same with California.
Woo, America!
It's good for the union to disband.
Yeah, exactly. Because that worked out very well in the past, didn't it?
And like it's very reasonable to think that this whole military exercise with the Navy SEALs and the special forces was just a cover story for some sort of even deeper threat,
I mean, look, when I think it was the Yom Kippur War. That war was launched under the pretext of military exercises.
happened
so
before.
I'm not saying these military exercises are a prelude to war, but they ain't been conducted for pure peace. Oh dear.
Yeah, this guy's clearly on the ball. He's a Republican and he knows what he's doing. So I think kudos to this guy. He's clearly all over it. I mean, the U.S. government's already been purported to be corrupt enough as it is. So
Yeah, the federal government, that is, not the state governments. The states are beyond reproach.
Especially
Absolutely.
Texas.
Yeah,
Texas
especially.
is just magnificent example of statehood right there.
Yeah, although I hear the cities are being tainted by damn commie influences. They're becoming godless liberals.
yeah, that's not
Yes,
what you
we
want.
need a good return to Christian Republican America,
We do.
guys.
Christian Republican values. Such as are still found in good old Texas in the country.
Yeah, that's our show for the week. Anyone have any concluding thoughts? Anything they're looking forward to this week? Any political shit
Russian.
fights that need to be dealt with?
The Russians revealed their family of armored fighting vehicles recently. That was pretty interesting. I mean, you knew they were going to do it, but it's interesting that they were actually able to. They said at the start of the year, we will have 20 of these new vehicles ready. And it's the Russians. You can't usually believe them. Their generals are renowned for being professional trolls. But this time, they actually did produce the goods. And they were there. And people were surprised. But there we go. Now
How long
they've-
until we see them in the Ukraine?
Yeah, that's a real question, isn't it? Nah, it'd be too obvious, surely, even for the Russians. They haven't sent T-90s into Ukraine. They won't send this new tank in. But we could end up seeing a legitimate Russian invasion of the Ukraine, or intervention, depending on your perspective.
Intervention to rescue the Russian Slavs. That's their pretext for it.
Yeah. And it's the same thing with those Baltic states. I hear there's some oppression going on over there. Oppression like the Russians are being conditioned to speak the local language. Anyway, on this disturbing thought, the show must conclude rather than go on. You have been listening to Political Party, putting the cool in political.